My name is Charlotte Cahill. I'm an associate vice president at Jobs for the Future in our education practice. I co-lead with my colleague Kyle Hartug, our Pathways to Prosperity Coalition. And we're really excited to invite you all or to have you all join us at this month's Pathways to Prosperity learning event that's focused on our new framework and report on implementing pathways in rural communities. I'm going to turn this over in just a minute to my colleague Sarah Janess, who has played a key role in developing both the report and framework to talk us through that today. But before I do, wanted to just say a couple of words about JFF and who we are and what Pathways to Prosperity is for those of you who might not be as familiar with us. Um, so JFF is a national nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 40 years now, and across all of that time, our mission has focused on driving the transformation of the US education and workforce systems to achieve equitable economic advancement for all. So we work across the country on that work across many different initiatives and projects, including our Pathways to Prosperity work. And for more than a decade through that work, we've been working with leaders across the country to design and scale education to career pathways. Our Pathways to Prosperity work is really operating at two different levels at once. One is to really create a space for national conversations like the one we're having today, where our aim is to bring more voices and more perspectives into those conversations so that we can all think together about the solutions that we need to be developing to address really what we know are persistent and durable inequities in our education systems and labor markets in order to achieve our goal of more equitable distribution of opportunity. And so, in addition to these national conversations, we work with cross-sector leaders in states and regions across the country to support the development of education to career pathways strategies that are tailored to state and regional contexts. So we work closely with state and local government agencies and associations, with 2- and 4-year colleges, with K-12 educators, with community-based organizations, with business and industry partners, with intermediary organizations, and with folks who work in workforce and economic development. We know that we need all of those people and more who are probably missing from this slide in order to really build out equitable pathways systems that lead to economic advancement for all Americans. So with that kind of brief preamble out of the way, I'm really excited to turn things over to Sarah and have her introduce herself and walk us through this new rural pathways framework that we're excited for. Sarah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining today. As Charlotte said, my name is Sarah Jennis and I'm a senior manager at Jobs for the Future. I've been here for about 6 years and the vast majority of my work has been focused on college and career pathways and subjects that relate to that, including labor market analysis, career navigation systems, as well as work-based learning. And because we are a national organization, I've had the privilege of working in many states across the country. A little bit about myself and my personal background. I was a low-income student who was Pell eligible and grew up with the message that education was the path to economic success. And while that is generally true, that we see that folks with more education also have higher earnings, we know that there is a lot of nuance behind that, including your field of study, what occupations are available where you live, and also the wraparound services needed to support a young person to and through a program of study into a career with living wages and that includes college and career advising opportunities. So one of the things that I really love about my work at JFF, and that you'll hear in some of this report today about rural pathways, is that we really dig into the nuances to strengthen systems level connections between education and career. So here is our agenda for today. I'm going to give an introduction to what this work is, how we started talking about rural pathways, and the connection to our work at JFF overall. I'm really excited to be able to share these rural pathways resources with you today. The Rural Pathways Framework, which is a shorter document, only about 4 pages, was published back in October, and the longer report was actually just published last week, so it is hot off the press. And this work is funded by an Education Innovation Research Grant from the Department of Education. So this webinar will primarily be presentation style, but please feel free to put questions or reactions in the chat as we go. Happy to have an active chat. If I miss questions, we'll also have opportunity for question and answer at the end. And while I'm going through my slides, my colleague Courtney is going to be dropping in useful links into the chat to speak to the resources that I mentioned. So the first link that she has already dropped in there is the link to the Rural Pathways resources on the JFF website. I wanted to open this presentation by making an explicit connection between pathways and economic development. For over a decade, JFF Pathways to Prosperity Network has supported the design and implementation of college and career pathways to help young people seamlessly advance from high school to post-secondary education to family supporting careers. This work is essential because we know how important post-secondary education is to economic well-being. By 2031, 70% of jobs across the country will require some level of post-secondary education. Now, there is some nuance to that. When we say post-secondary education, we don't just mean a bachelor's degree, but sometimes a bachelor's degree, sometimes it's an associate's degree, and sometimes it's an in-demand credential. So some level of education and training is needed beyond high school because only about 6% of good jobs will be available to those who only hold a high school diploma. And this is important for rural communities because we see a gap in educational attainment rates, with rural communities and rural adults having earned associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees. About 31% of adults have done so, compared to 45% of urban adults. So to support economic vitality in rural communities, it's really essential to address this disparity and strengthen the connections that exist between education and career. So what do we mean when we are talking about rural? We really found over the past 5 years or so of doing this work that the best way to understand a rural community is to ask its members. So this slide shows responses from our US Department of Education grantees who we worked with on this project to develop pathways. We asked them, what are characteristics of rural communities? And you'll notice that the grantees describe their rural communities with a mix of strengths and a mix of challenges that they see. I'm going to pause for a moment to let you look over the words on this slide. And if you want, feel free in the chat to name what are words that resonate with you, or what are some words that you would add to this slide. So as you're thinking about your specific rural community, I also want to name some national trends that we saw that I think are important context for this work. So one is that research from the 2020 US Census shows that about 20% of the US population lives in rural communities. And additionally, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, about 30% of public schools are rural. So as we're thinking about this work and pathways, we're talking about a significant part of the country. That being said, there is no single definition of rural. Most definitions do include at least one of the following factors. So they consider population size and density, the proximity to an urban area, as well as if an area has been given designation by a state or federal agency as rural. And awesome, I see some of you responding in the chat. Thank you for taking the time to do that. So for our work and for this project, rather than JFF creating a new absolute definition of rural, our vision was to create resources that provide support and guidance to those who live in rural communities and those who experience common rural challenges. And these include limited job opportunities resulting from macroeconomic shifts, considerable geographic distance among pathways partners, as well as a lack of infrastructure to support pathways. We hope that this work really benefits a variety of pathway stakeholders across education, business and industry, workforce and economic development, as well as local and state governments. And it was exciting because when we looked at the registration list for this event, we definitely saw stakeholders from across those groups. So grateful to have you all here digging into this work with us. Before I jump into the framework, I wanted to mention a couple myths that come up commonly, and I might be preaching to the choir with this audience. But as we were doing this work, some of the things that we ran into were folks thinking that rural communities were really limited in the United States, or maybe they were in certain states or certain parts of the country, but that's not true. Rural communities exist in every state across the country. They're not limited to just Midwestern states or Appalachia region. Similarly, sometimes we hear that rural communities are, incredibly white and are over a vast majority white. And what we saw from the data looking at the census is that 24% of rural Americans identify as people of color. And furthermore, the fastest growing racial and ethnic population within rural communities is Latina residents. So we expect that number to continue to go up in the future. My last framing slide before I jump into the Rural Pathways Framework itself is to ground us in JFF's investment and approach to building frameworks. So for those of you who are familiar with JFF, you may be aware that we have several frameworks, and Courtney is going to drop the links to a few in the chat. So we have the Rural Pathways Framework, which we're talking about today. We have a work-based learning framework. We have a quality jobs framework, and so on and so forth. And the reason we develop these frameworks is for a couple key reasons. One is we want to make sure that we are elevating and amplifying innovative and tried and true practices across education and workforce systems. And number two is we want to make sure that we are delivering high quality, accessible, and actionable tools that support equitable economic advancement. So when you look at these frameworks, you're not going to be able to just copy and paste the resources to your particular community. You'll have to think about, what does it mean to adapt these principles to your specific community and context? With JFF's work as an intermediary, we do a lot of work with you all in the field, and we learn a lot from you. And so you'll see in this presentation today, we'll give some examples from the field of what folks are doing in terms of rural pathways. And we as an organization see it as our responsibility both to distill and amplify the learnings from the broader field in accessible and action-oriented tools like frameworks. And again, frameworks are not meant to be prescriptive, but to provide digestible, high-level guidance that can be tailored to your specific context. So without further ado, let's dig into the Rural Pathways implementation strategies. So we've talked about the audience, we've talked about the framing. Now we'll dig into the specific strategies themselves. And you'll notice that there are 3 strategies, and each strategy has 3 sub-strategies. So we will start with building on local strengths and context. So this involves thinking about, what does your community do well that you can build on? And what are local assets that you can leverage? While rural communities will vary in their strengths, data does demonstrate that rural communities tend to have higher levels of social capital, as well as pride in and a desire to remain in their communities. So those are 2 strengths that may be relevant to your community. The second strategy is thinking about prioritizing inclusive economic development. So knowing that pathways are an economic development strategy, how can you ensure that it's a process that's inclusive and considers the needs of both community and industry rather than pitting groups against one another? And the final strategy that we will dig in today is thinking about how to embed different remote opportunities. As we were developing these resources, one of the things that we wanted to avoid was asking rural communities to take action that essentially was asking them to urbanize. So knowing that two of the biggest challenges in rural communities are often physical distance between partners and a limited labor market, embedding remote opportunities for education and career seems more beneficial and realistic than asking rural communities to do things like develop more robust public transportation or bring in a handful of new businesses. So let's start by talking about building on local strengths and context. And so when we think about this strategy, one of the things we think about is we know a history of collaboration to support the community and a foundation of trust are important strengths that many rural communities have in place already. These characteristics give rural communities an advantage as they begin to mobilize the partnerships across sectors that are really the cornerstone of successful pathways initiatives. The first sub-strategy of creating a shared vision involves thinking about what is a common goal that pathway stakeholders can get behind that meets a shared need to ensure buy-in across stakeholders. The second strategy, align on efforts and establish shared infrastructure. The word infrastructure, I know it can mean a lot of things. We might be talking about highways, we might be talking about childcare. For this particular presentation and for pathways, the infrastructure that we're going to use as a backdrop is JFF's 5 pathways to prosperity levers. So I'll dig into those in just a moment. And the last sub-strategy here is fostering durable relationships. So thinking about how can we shift from individual staff connections and relationships to more formalized relationships between organizations that are really sustainable. So we will start with create a shared vision. Successful college and career pathways involve cross-sector partnerships from all the partners you see on this slide, and maybe more. So we have K-12, post-secondary, government, business, and workforce partners. And to build buy-in from all of these partners, you'll need to create a shared vision that meets the needs of all of these stakeholders. So that vision could be something like develop education and training that supports seamless transitions from school to career to build a skilled talent pipeline. But you'll want to think of what is the specific context in your region as you're building out that vision. When you're creating a shared vision, it's important to identify and leverage your community strengths. All communities, including urban, suburban, and rural, will have barriers when successfully implementing pathways. And it is important to note those barriers because you want to prioritize what challenges you want to address. But when you're developing your vision, it's really essential to not get bogged down by those challenges and to identify your strengths that your community can build on to move toward your shared vision together. A specific step that community members can take to develop their mission is a process that we at JFF refer to as asset mapping. So asset mapping is a process that identifies a community's strengths, illuminating areas for shared coordination while avoiding duplicating efforts. So research to support asset mapping can include steps like taking a look at your partner's strategic plans to find the commonalities to build that shared vision around, interviewing stakeholders to ensure that your community plan or that your plan is community informed, reviewing labor market data to ensure that you are meeting your region's needs and backward mapping from the labor market needs. So what are the high wage, high demand industries in your region that you want to build pathways towards? And then finally, you can use all this research to make recommendations about how to have better connections between education and career in your region. So that is creating a shared vision. And once that vision has been set and recommendations have been made, partners can continue to work together to align efforts and establish shared infrastructure. So this is what I mentioned at the beginning, infrastructure, referring to the pathways to prosperity levers here. And Courtney will share a link for that in the chat if you are curious about digging into like what these levers are in more details. So what we were thinking about here on the levers is what are common challenges that rural communities experience across these levers, and what are some examples of common strengths that we might see. For example, when I look at the second row down, career navigation systems, this one of the examples of rural strengths is that often business partners are already invested in student success. So they may be offering opportunities like mentoring or worksite tours. So there may already be existing connections between business partners and education in your region. On the flip side, a common rural challenge that we might see with this lever is that there's a limited number of industries and businesses within the community. So students may have an interest or skills for an industry and occupation that would provide a high quality of life, but maybe that's not an industry that is available in your particular region. Similarly, the fourth row down talks about intermediaries, and intermediaries play such a crucial role in this work. They are often the folks who are really convening cross-sector stakeholders to come together around what is this shared vision. So one of the rural strengths when it comes to intermediaries is that there's often already an existing entity like an economic development council or a workforce board, a chamber of commerce, as well as education service centers, and all sorts of organizations that can support this pathways work and bringing together stakeholders. But the challenge in rural communities is that staff and financial resources at potential intermediary organizations are often more limited when compared to their urban counterparts. Another action step that folks can take here as they're thinking about aligning efforts and establishing shared infrastructure is to complete a fiscal mapping process. So fiscal mapping involves looking at the different pathway stakeholder budgets to determine where are financial resources going and where are more financial resources needed to support pathways priority. And how can that be achieved through rated funding or pooling funding across partners? So for example, if you have set your vision and cross-sector stakeholders across your region agree that work-based learning is a priority, and there's different pools of money going towards smaller initiatives, how can that potentially be combined across partners toward a more powerful impact in your region, or towards offering more opportunities for young people to participate in work-based learning? So that's just one example. The next sub-strategy here is focusing on fostering durable relationships. So the first piece of this is really thinking about memorandums of understanding and partnership agreements. And while handshake agreements or agreements that are simply based on trust are appreciative because they're indicative of strong relationships in the region, at the end of the day, because staffing and roles can shift over time, it's really important to move beyond handshake agreements and document agreements on paper to support more sustainable partnerships. So examples of agreements between partners might be a simple partnership agreement that outlines who's doing what and what are the different roles involved in that. There are also work-based learning MOUs that outline opportunities that will be offered regarding work-based learning and which partner is responsible for what piece of the work. And there are also examples, or there are MOUs that document dual enrollment opportunities and what courses are transferable and the financing plans behind those. And Courtney has just shared a link in the chat. JFF has a resource in which we talk about why MOUs are important and also provide some templates. I know that can be a difficult area to start. If you have not designed an MOU before, I think it's really helpful to have those templates as a starting point. Another thing that we think about here with fostering durable relationship is shifting from programs and events to systems and infrastructure. So this strategy involves leveraging existing programming and events and scaling those existing programming and events to support pathway systems and infrastructure to support longer term goals and continuums of experience rather than a single opportunity. So for example, if your community offers an annual career day for students, that's a really great opportunity that can be built into a larger career exploration and experience continuum. So that continuum can begin with learning about careers through events like career days and guest speakers coming to visit classrooms. And then it can get into more advanced activities like resume building and mock interviews, and eventually prepare students for more advanced work-based learning opportunities like internships and apprenticeships and on-the-job training. And as I mentioned before, intermediaries are really an essential part of fostering durable relationships. I think I named this earlier, but if the term intermediaries is unfamiliar to you, some examples of intermediaries that we see in this field doing pathways work include organizations like workforce boards, economic development councils, community colleges, and education service centers, as well as chambers of commerce. And so intermediaries are really crucial for convening and connecting partners and helping to lead the vision of Pathways work. So they are the folks sort of driving the work forward. And to be a successful intermediary, you must be an entity that is trusted and respected by other stakeholders in the region, because this work really moves at the pace of having that trust and having that relationship. So we have talked about what the first strategy is, and I want to offer a couple examples of from the field that we saw where folks were building on local strengths and context. So our first example comes from our friends in McLean County, Illinois, and they have this McLean County Compact, which is a network of employers and educators who collaborate to increase connections between learning and work, improve education and career readiness, as well as growing a skilled talent pipeline. So they began this work back in 1989, and they started out as a nonprofit, and the work has shifted to now they are a subsidiary of the Chamber of Commerce. And they're guided by their strategic plan to carry out this work through 4 committees. So they have an employer engagement committee, a programming committee, evaluation, and governance committee. So that's a really great example of starting with that vision for them. They have the strategic plan, and then they have processes for implementing the strategic plan through these 4 committees. Another example of folks in the field who are doing this work well is a nonprofit called Rural Schools Innovation Zone in South Texas. So Rural Schools Innovation Zone is a local intermediary who partners with local high schools, colleges, employers, and workforce organizations. And they believe that collaboration strengthens rural schools, and they use this collaboration to support high quality pathways. So because these schools are from several rural communities, they have worked together to say we are going to have students from across 5 districts enroll in our school Next Generation Medical Academy, which offers healthcare pathways. Because healthcare is a high demand, high wage industry in their part of the country, but the individual schools do not have the funding, the staff, or the capacity to individually offer these pathways. So these schools have had to come together. They've had to coordinate their master schedules, coordinate transportation, and what happens is students from across the 5 districts take their core coursework, including English, math, science, and history courses at their neighborhood school or their district school. And then they are all transported to Next Generation Medical Academy for their health science specific coursework. And the goal of Next Generation Medical Academy is ultimately to develop a pathway that leads from a high school diploma to a licensed vocational nursing credential to a registered nursing degree. So those are a couple examples from the field. Okay, we can now dig into our second strategy, which is around prioritizing inclusive economic development. This strategy outlines how pathways contribute to talent pipelines that align with regional labor markets and adapt to both internal and external shocks that the economy might face. So rural communities can create strong economies that work for everyone by adopting strategies that encourage resilience and advance shared prosperity. So each of the sub-strategies here, the first one is focus on quality jobs. We don't want to just consider what jobs are in demand, but also what the quality of those jobs is, which includes but isn't limited to paying a living wage. The second sub-strategy is ensuring inclusive processes and outcomes. Economic development doesn't necessarily or shouldn't be pitting businesses and community members against one another, but really supporting all stakeholder needs and investing in local assets. So how can we create a cycle of economic success by investing in pathways? So the first sub-strategy is focused on quality jobs. And some of the facts here or the stats that we found are really You'll see why we need to focus on quality jobs. So we know that more than half of the people in the US labor force, which is 92 million people, work in jobs that do not meet JFF's definition of a quality job. In that same group, we know that 36 million Americans work in jobs that pay less than $17 an hour and have high turnover, worker tenures of less than 18 months or less. So we want to think about not just what jobs are in demand in your region, but also which jobs pay a living wage, which jobs have benefits, and support opportunities for growth and advancement. So on the left side of the slide, you see a very quick summary of the components that make up JFF's quality jobs framework. But on the right side is what I want to dig into on the national trends when it comes to rural communities. So what we see on the right side is the 6 industries that employ the most rural workers. And so when we were looking at this data, we saw the national average hourly wage is about $34 an hour. And we look at the wages for retail and for accommodation and food services, those drop to $24 an hour approximately and $21 an hour. So the challenge is that many of the industries and rural communities that are in demand also do not pay living wages. So you'll see that government, manufacturing, and healthcare are highlighted in blue. And the reason we did that is because those are potentially good pathways to consider in your region. Government is italicized because it is the largest industry in rural communities across the board, but stakeholders will have to take a closer look at their specific labor market information to determine what occupations fall under this field. And it could include industries like IT, education, and utilities. But just due to the large variation in skills needed for industries, it's best for rural communities to develop specific pathways that are needed based on their government needs. If you have a particular government pathway, that will likely be thinking about legislative roles and skills for that. But healthcare and manufacturing are promising industries for pathways development. Again, it depends on your local labor market information, but the national data shows high demand for these fields, health, manufacturing and healthcare, and there are numerous jobs that pay a living wage in this region. However, there is some nuance here. Again, both fields do have jobs that pay low wages that we want to avoid. When we look at manufacturing, communities should pay careful attention to the sectors that they're considering. So fields like advanced manufacturing and clean energy hold a lot of promise, and they're also experiencing a lot of increased federal investment right now. So there's funding opportunities to support such sectors. And with healthcare, again, we want to be careful to avoid some of those low wage positions that are really hard to advance from. That can include positions like home health aide, EMTs, and phlebotomists. But on the flip side, there are many jobs that are accessible in healthcare that do not require a bachelor's degree and also pay a living wage. So it can be jobs like a respiratory therapist, a radiological technician, and a dental hygienist. And then, of course, many folks know that there are many jobs in healthcare that pay quite well and also require a lot of education. So those are jobs like doctor, dentist, and surgeon. So again, really thinking about what are the most strategic pathways for your region based on your local labor market information. The next strategy here is thinking about inclusive economic development to ensure voices from diverse racial, cultural, and economic backgrounds set investment priorities to benefit all stakeholders and to improve quality of life across the region. So some inequities that we see in the data both exist across and among rural communities. So for example, we see that when compared to their urban peers, rural residents are more likely to face higher unemployment and financial insecurity. But there are also inequities within rural communities that folks should really try to collect data on to address appropriately. So what this slide shows is median household income by race for rural Americans. And what we see is that Asian and white households have the highest income and Native American and Black households have the lowest income. So again, looking at your data to think about what are the outcomes in terms of wage disparities and how can we address those And Pathways is one of the strategies to address that by building strong talent pipelines to advance shared prosperity across the region. And Pathways can also work to disrupt occupational segregation, which is a trend in which we see Black, Latine, Native American, and women of all races may be overrepresented in low wage positions. And then folks who are white and men overrepresented in high wage positions. Inclusive economic development is important and can work to address these inequities by considering both the process of economic development and the outcomes of strategies being used. Oh, when I see Courtney shared in the chat, and I forgot to mention, the living wage calculator is really in regards to quality jobs. So we talked about, low wage jobs, high wage jobs. Your wages are really dependent on where you are in the country. So the resource that Courtney shared, you can look at your particular part of the country and see what is the living wage for my region. And the living wage considers absolute needs like housing, health insurance, transportation, food. It does not consider aspects like saving for retirement or going out to eat. So with a living wage, JFF uses the amount for one adult plus one child when we are making living wage recommendations. So the third sub-strategy is thinking about investing in local assets. So when we were looking at rural economic development, we saw that a common strategy is focused on bringing in new employers, which definitely is a strategy that can create jobs, but also often takes time and outside funding and can involve compromises that don't always prioritize the needs of current residents in the region. So in contrast, Pathways support inclusive economic development by creating a skilled talent pipeline of workers and by supporting young people to obtain living wage jobs that already exist in a community. Economic development strategies that retain, expand, and attract small businesses are really essential in this situation. So these businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, actually already employ about 65% of rural workers. So they make up a huge part of the workforce population. They create new jobs, they increase the tax base, and they also, of course, provide goods and services to the community. Another rural economic development strategy is placemaking. So placemaking is a method for ensuring that a community is both a welcoming and attractive place for folks to live and work. Placemaking is a broad term, but it can include things that definitely relate back to Pathways, like having partnerships that benefit the communities, hosting events and networks that bring folks together, and making physical updates to the community to make the community more vibrant. I would argue that Pathways are inherently a placemaking strategy because families want to live in communities where high quality schools that prepare their students, where high quality schools exist that prepare their students for college and career success. The last piece here about investing in local assets, and we'll start to get into this more in the last section, is investing in infrastructures to support remote workers. So we talk about remote opportunities more in the next section, but remote work is a potential win for rural communities as folks who desire to live in this rural quality of life now have more access to remote opportunities as those work opportunities increase. However, rural communities may need to demonstrate to rural workers that they have sufficient infrastructure, including high-speed broadband, to sufficiently support remote work. So that is the second strategy. We want to give a couple examples from the field of folks prioritizing inclusive economic development. One is that in 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, in Hawaii, we saw cross-sector partners come together to develop a roadmap to support economic recovery. Hawaii was one of the states that was really hit hardest by the pandemic due to the economy's reliance on tourism. And so COVID was a catalyst for stakeholders in the community to reimagine industries and jobs based on their specific context. And part of this work was reimagining the high demand industries of agriculture and tourism to improve job quality. So we worked with partners to discuss the key skills needed for these fields that were also transferable to other industries. These skills included things like sustainability, host culture, and technology. And by focusing on building these skills, The industries would improve overall, but they would also open doors for workers to advance economically into related fields like manufacturing and skilled trades. So really thinking about how can we reimagine and improve agriculture and tourism to make those jobs higher quality. The second example from the field was from our partners in Fresno, California. So the F3 Innovation Coalition is working to double the workforce pipeline of job-ready workers with support from the Build Back Better Regional Challenge Award from the US Economic Development Administration. And the goal that they have in mind is to develop climate smart food and agriculture technology for an engineering cluster. So to develop the best training opportunities, the process involved working with two major community-based organizations, as well as hearing from over 1,000 farm workers to understand what their needs are to make this training successful. Because of this process, worker needs were factored into the design of the training, and they included wraparound services like childcare, classes for English language learners, as well as flexible delivery models, including online instructions. And by involving workers and community-based organizations, they found that this led to strengthened partnerships because those partners felt like their ideas were incorporated into the design of the training and they felt heard in this process. The final strategy in the Rural Pathways Framework is to embed remote opportunities. So we know that geographic distance does not have to mean distance from education and employment opportunities, and that rural communities can take advantage of online and remote education and work opportunities to build high quality pathways that allow residents to remain in their communities. One of the challenging parts of offering remote opportunities is, of course, access to high-speed broadband. So the good news is that the digital divide between urban and rural communities has narrowed considerably over the last decade. Pew Research shows that between 2016 and 2021, rural broadband increased by 9%, and that in 2021, 77% of US adults overall had home broadband compared to 72% of rural adults. So there's that 5 percentage point gap. And again, it's continuing to be addressed. It is a challenge, but this is really a policy issue that often requires collaboration to address among local, state, and federal governments. We will share in the chat, we found a resource that speaks to potential partnerships and funding resources for broadband, and that was the USDA's Broadband Resources for Rural America Guide. The first sub-strategy here is thinking about offering online dual enrollment. So overcoming distance is a big challenge, again, for rural communities. And we know that 82% of folks who live in higher education deserts, which are areas that are at least a 30-minute drive from a college or university, are rural residents. JFF is a huge proponent of dual enrollment because studies show that students who participate in dual enrollment are both more likely to enroll in and to complete a post-secondary credential. Dual enrollment also allows students who are less likely to attend college the chance to try it on and boost their confidence as they complete courses while saving time and money toward their credential. For dual enrollment to be successful, it must go hand in hand with strategic advising and a clear course sequence so that students can avoid what we refer to as random acts of dual enrollment that don't support them in strategically progressing toward degree completion. Ideally, dual enrollment coursework contains a mix of rigorous core academics from subjects like English, history, math, and science, as well as career-focused courses that support students in developing skills that they need to succeed in an in-demand industry in their community. The next strategy here is developing remote work-based learning experiences. So, excuse me, JFF defines work-based learning as an experience in which a student goes into a workplace or works with an industry professional and performs meaningful job tasks to develop their skills, knowledge, and readiness for work. These include experiences like internships, apprenticeships, and on-the-job training. And as a growing number of workplaces have increased opportunities for remote work, that also means that opportunities have increased for remote work-based learning. So remote work-based learning benefits rural communities because it increases the quantity of opportunities that are available it expands potential partnerships, and it diversifies the industries that are accessible to young people. Some examples of tasks that students and young people can do in work-based learning experiences that are conducted remotely include IT support, record keeping, scheduling, research and data analysis, web design, event planning, as well as social media support and developing marketing materials. And work-based learning is a key entry point to a full-time job. In 2021, 66.4% of interns became full-time employees. In addition to skill development, work-based learning is crucial for students to develop their professional networks and to build social capital. Work-based learning solves for the catch-22, which is that you need experience to get a job, but you need a job to get experience. So supporting remote work-based learning will open more doors for rural students to build that social capital and build their professional network and gain those valuable professional skills. The last sub-strategy here is supporting remote workers and work opportunities, which can both retain and attract more rural residents. So remote work is a key method for ensuring rural residents have access to a diverse range of job opportunities that pay a living wage. Many high-wage roles exist in fields like technology, business and finance, and legal services, and these are all industries that often have remote work opportunities. Remote workers support the local economy by bringing in tax revenue and also spending their folks who are in remote jobs spend their money locally. Building infrastructure for remote work includes, of course, ensuring access to high-speed broadband, but it might also involve physical co-working spaces. These co-working spaces could be traditional office space or maybe located at public institutions like libraries and community colleges. And supporting remote work can be a strategy for preventing brain drain of skilled rural residents who really love the quality of life in their community, but may have professional skills and interests in an industry that's not physically located in their community. As we saw during the pandemic, remote work can attract new residents who appreciate the rural quality of life and have the flexibility to do their work from anywhere in the country. So we will wrap up here with a couple examples of folks from across the country who are embedding remote opportunities. So the first example is of social emotional dual enrollment supports from a JFF project called Increasing College Access Network, or ICANN. And this project is currently in progress with 2 partner colleges in Minnesota. We work with Alexandra Technical and Community College and Minnesota West Community and Technical College. The goal of this work is to create smooth transitions from secondary to post-secondary by increasing authentic learning through online dual enrollment courses while reimagining what online learning spaces can look like with a strong emphasis on social emotional learning. Because online learning requires so much self-direction on the part of students, especially when compared with traditional classroom learning, the partners are really focusing on 3 components. One is ensuring that there are student-educator relationships to support and motivate learners. 2 is having pedagogy that includes rigorous core content and supports to apply the concepts and skills that students are learning in their remote courses. And number 3 is having accessible technology that blends various tools based on the learning goals and the context. Incorporating social emotional learning into dual enrollment courses is a promising solution for addressing some of the gaps that we currently see with online learning. The second example from the field that we want to share is remote tech internships that were offered in Fremont, Colorado. And where we saw there is the Economic Development Corporation was able to serve as a work-based learning intermediary to connect high school students to internships in the technology field. Because they are a rural community, there wasn't a single business partner who could provide a large number of internships to a large number of students. So the Economic Development Corporation partnered with 25 small businesses to create 3-month internships. And these internships involved key computer science and technology tasks like software development, drone flights, digital marketing, computer-aided design, and digital videography. The internships were forced to be remote during the pandemic, but the remote opportunities are still utilized on a smaller scale for students who are so physically distant from an employer that they wouldn't be able to have this opportunity otherwise. Representatives from the organization did say that they still find internships that are in person to be higher quality, but they're working to build in supports to make remote opportunities even stronger. And these have included things like intensive internship onboarding, coaching and mentoring for remote interns, video series to support the development of employability or soft skills. And finally, they also recommend bringing together interns and their business partners at least once a month. So primarily a remote opportunity, but a little bit of hybrid where those opportunities are possible to bring folks together in person. So we are, I think, low on time, but we have made it through the formal presentation. And I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. I think I may have seen earlier in the chat, someone asked if this is being recorded and we're sharing slides. And the answer to that is yes. We will share the recording and the slides. If you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. When I was looking at the registration, a couple of folks did add questions right in there. So I can address at least the first one that I saw, which is how can local workforce boards support this effort? And I hope you heard some of that during the presentation, but to directly answer, I think workforce boards are well positioned to potentially be part of the intermediary role because they work sort of between education and workforce. They might already have those relationships between essential pathways partners, and they will definitely have information on labor market data in your region to help you think about what are the high wage, high demand jobs that we can build pathways toward in our communities. Someone else said, I'm eager to learn more about how you can help students have opportunities in their own backyard while opening them to big ideas that might be outside of what the rural community can offer them. Should rural students be limited to what is in their community? And again, I hope I touched on that in the presentation. I think it's a mix. What we see is that a lot of young people will remain in the area that they grew up in. So it's important to think about that local labor market context and what are the high wage, high demand jobs in your community that are going to be available. But for folks who are interested in staying in the community, but also maybe venturing out to jobs that are not as popular in your region, that's where I think those remote opportunities can come in and people can really have the best of both worlds. Ooh. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I will move to close us out. One last time, I wanted to share those Rural Pathways resources. So we have the Rural Pathways framework that we went through today and the report, which digs into some of the stats and the examples that we talked about in this presentation today. Courtney is also sharing a couple other rural resources that we have at JFF, including a rural dual enrollment case study and a blog about developing computer science pathways in rural communities.